So thanks everybody for joining. Today in this series, we're going to talk about the using Domino Vault to interact with services. Now, as we're putting this together, this can go pretty deep and pretty broad. So I'm going to introduce a bunch of topics and different techniques and ways that services are used. Now, there's some other things that you can do with services and some custom things, and we'll touch on those. But due to time and some of the depth on this, we'll go kind of broad. So we'll kind of go through the basic concepts, local vote services versus calling the external REST, how to synchronize. We'll talk about a custom transport, and then on the different types of events and submit actions. So kind of at a high level, if we think about services, so service is a way that you can interact with data, and you could either call data from either an existing Leap application or Bolt application, or you can call from an external service such as a Salesforce or a public REST API or something else. So examples would be, if you wanted to do a validation on a zip code or a postcode and an address, you could actually call a service, pass it that postal code, and have it return some sort of result or standards. Another way you might want to pass information that's stored in Bolt into a backend system like an HR system or a Salesforce, CRM, something like that, where you're going to actually submit information to that backend system. So it works both ways. You can either return information, or you can get information or send information back and forth using services around that. And you can update, and you can submit and save, et cetera, like that. They do expect a certain type of structure for parameters, so they all have inputs, they all have outputs. Now, not every service is obviously going to have an input, not every service is going to necessarily have an output, but they're all structured the same. So no matter if you launch them from a submit action, or if you do it on an event action, those features are all the same, and then the structures are very same. So it makes it very easy to kind of interact with services around that. But just think of a service, it's a way that you can interact with other Bolt applications to get and send information, or within the same application, or with external services. So if you need to update systems or get information or pricing or employee information, whatever it may be, to interact with other types of information and data, so you can pre-fill your forms. So if we think as a Volt app, so every Volt app that gets created gets a set of services created with it. And it's the typical, what we refer to as kind of the CRUD delivery system. So you can create a new record, you can update an existing record, you can search for records, you can retrieve a single record, and obviously you can delete records. And then there's permissions associated with this, and we'll touch on that when we get into the demo around this. But basically, if you think about this, there's inputs and outputs, as I mentioned before. Some of the differentiators, for example, for a search is going to return multiple items. Even if that item only has one result, it's still treated as a multi-return. So there's going to be some rules around where that data can go, versus a retrieve, which is more, I'm going to pass it a unique ID and retrieve a singular record or that matches one or more criteria. From the input standpoint, it's going to return one, and that would be, an example of that would be go get employee first name, last name, and address when given the employee ID, versus the search where it says go find all employees who have this as their city, and it's going to return multiple around that. But it's a nice piece of this is that every Bolt application that you create gets its own set of services that then other Bolt applications can interact with around that. Another concept here are when you can call services. So there's obviously events and actions that take place. So obviously on the application start. So this might be a scenario where when the application starts, you want to go get some employee information, or you want to populate a queue for them to start working through transactions, or maybe you need to go get an access token so that you can then interact with other services on the page. So it can happen on start, load, obviously form load and page load. There's a couple of use cases in here when you might want to do that, and when you call these services. You can do it, on show. When a drop-down list shows on the page, go and get the values for that drop-down list and populate that drop-down list, for example. or if it's a hidden field until you select a certain object and then it shows and you want to call a service on that show. So all of the events, basically, you can call services off of, and we'll see some of this in the demo, as well as the larger events as far as start, load, et cetera, like that. And then you can also call them upon submission. So when you're in a workflow and you move from one stage to the next, you can call one or more services at that time. An example of that might be that when you submit a HR record, so a request record to take time off, for example, you input your information into it, and then when you submit it, maybe it populates a back-end time tracking system to show that you're going to be blocked on those pieces. And so then you can call it upon submission. So when it's successful, then it'll post that into that record system. Or maybe it needs to go pull some more information for your manager to see how many days you have available and things like that. So services can be triggered at various points. Obviously when you start off the application on load, or any of the individual events, actions, as well as upon form submission. So there's some scenarios around where you might do each of those. So as I talked about, they all kind of follow the same structure. I won't break these down into individual pieces, but basically, when you go in to configure a service, you're going to pick the type. And so the type of service is either going to be by URL, which means I'm going to call out to an external service, or URL addressable REST service that's going to return some data or allow me to post some data. Or I can select a service from the current application. I could also select from another Vault application that's in the same environment, or general, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Sometimes you'll hear those referred to as transports. But basically the options there is, do I want to get data from my current application and the forms that are in the Vault application I'm currently working on, or do I want to go get data from another application and populate this form with that, or do I want to use one that's been made available to me by my admin around that? And I'll show you an example in the demo of that. And then the last piece is obviously to pick which one. Are you going to be doing any of those operations I mentioned earlier? Are you going to be searching for something? Are you going to go retrieve a singular item? Are you going to delete? Are you creating, or are you updating those? And you'll see your entire list of options built, whether you choose current application or another Vault application. And then if you choose the general piece, it'll be based on how that one's actually defined. That's kind of the first step. So when you go to create a service configuration, you need to tell it what type you're working on. The second piece is the input. So when you hit next or you click inputs on the top, you'll see your options. So on the left-hand side, you'll see whatever inputs are required, which would be items typically from your application itself. All of the fields in your pieces. What do you want to pass to this service to then get results? So if you're doing a search, for example, like I'm doing here, I might want to search by a certain role type. And here you can see that I'm putting in a constant. So you have the ability to actually select from your form or application fields, or you can select underneath that view to pass a constant. And so what this is doing here is I'm going to tie that to the role, and I'm going to put the criteria that says return me all of the records where the role is product specialist. And again, because this is a search, it's going to return multiple. The other thing that I put in here is I put a constant in there, and I put the ID field name, and then one of the options is order by. So when the results come back, I want them sorted by this field. So you're basically saying, here's your filter. Now on a search, you may not put any inputs in, but you'll definitely have outputs. And the same thing when you're going to do a retrieve, you're going to want to put inputs in because you're going to be retrieving a singular record and you want to tell it what to do this. But this is how you can kind of filter those out. Some services have required inputs, typically in the general transport pieces or from one of your URL address ones, that they'll have fields that are required and they'll be indicated here. You can't go past until you actually pass it a value. You can also do things like pagination, and as I mentioned here, order by and things like that. So if you only want to return the first 10 items and then have them page through, there's examples of how to do that. And then you can do some advanced criteria such as greater than or less than, greater than and equal to, includes, contains, typical, other filtering. But this is where you're going to basically put in the inputs or your filters for your service. Once you define what it is you're going after, it's going to tell you, well, here's everything that's coming back. So we just swapped windows. So on the left-hand side, you can see that this is everything coming back from that service. And so what I want to do then is say, well, I want to take this value and I want to put it in this field. And so you're just going to do a match and click. So you're going to pick name. I want to put that in the displayed value. And then I hit the little link button there as number 4, and it adds it to my list. So what I'm going to do is, in this example here, I'm building a drop-down list. And so you can see that in the saved value of the drop-down, I'm going to put the unique ID. And then in the display value, I'm going to put the name. You could put name in both, or you could put different values in there, but this is just where you're going to match what's coming back from your service to where it goes in your application. And again, this is the same format, whether you're doing from another Bolt application or if you're doing it from a REST service, it's going to show the same values in there. A couple things to keep note of. The types have to match, and you'll get an error message if you don't. What I mean by that is if you're trying to take a string value from your results and put it into a date field on your review, or maybe the other way around if you're trying to take a date. And so that there are some caveats in there that you can stick certain fields in there, but based on the type of field coming back, like a checkbox or a true value or Boolean value, something like that, needs to go into the same type of field on the other side. And it's going to restrict you from doing that. And give you messages as to it has to be the same type. The other thing that we typically run into is you have to have the same type of, or the same set of items coming back. And what we mean by that is, again, with a search, it's going to return multiple items. So think of this as, an array of sets coming back. So it has to go into something like a drop-down list or a table or a multi-select item, something that's expecting to get multiple results back. Whereas when you do a retrieve, it's only returning a singular object, so just a string of data, really. So in that case, it's going to go into single items, like a single line input or a text box or something like that, where it's not multiple. And keep this in mind too when you're working with REST services. Some REST services, even though they only return a single value, still return it back as an array of sets. And so you have to put them into a table initially and then go get the data from that table. So if you start to see the error message on the same number of ancestors, that's what the issue is that your result set is returning either a group of results, or it's turning a singular and you're trying to put it into one or the other. So when you see that there. And the last thing to check is make sure that if you are accessing other Bolt applications in your environment, that those Bolt applications are actually set up to allow you to act as a service. And I'll show you that setting in there. What we mean is you can lock down your applications so that they're not available to do updates. Maybe it's only allowed to do reads, or that you can do updates, but you can't do deletes. And you can configure that option in there. So make sure that those are set when you go into that field. So let me jump in here and go into the demo application that I have. Now I have most of these built out so that you don't have to watch me type and configure, but the very first one that we're going to take a look at is simply just populating a drop-down from a query. And the way this is working here, I'll show you here in the preview, is that when this page loads, you can see that it now loaded the results. And this result set is coming from a Bolt application with some data into it. And the way that we do that is we talked about the service piece. So in the form and in a drop-down, you have the option, obviously, to do default, which is you're just going to hard code in some values in there, or I can call a service. And this service is just going to go retrieve from the same application. In my form, I'm going to go do a search. So you can see here in my list, I'm doing a search on this application called Form 2. And what it tells me, it says, well, do you need to filter it by anything? And I'm not. Or like before, I can put in a constant and say, I want to sort it by department. So I'm just going to put in field name, field ID name that you see here in department. And down here, you can do an order by. So what it's going to do is order the results by that. And there's other things. If I wanted to search by a department that contained a certain value or had a particular ID or it had another field in here, this is where I would put it. So this is your filters on your search as to what you want to narrow the results down to. The next step, as we talked about, was the output. So now you can see, because I'm doing a search, it's going to return multiple items. It's returning a list of items. So if I tried to take, for example, this item and just put it into this field, for example, this is that error that it's going to give me. What it's telling me is it's saying you're trying to take a list of items and stick it into a single element. And you'll see that message here. So if you see that, then you'll recognize it. And you can kind of tell by the structure of this request. But what I'm going to do here is all I'm doing is I'm sticking this into the drop-down list. So you can see at the bottom, I'm going to take the results, which is the department, and I'm going to put it into the saved value, and I'm going to put the department again into the displayed value. I'm not going to put the unique ID. I'm just going to put both in there. So that's the view and the saved value of that. And the last screen on here, this is where, as a developer, you can really help yourself out. Again, just like when you name ID fields, this is kind of nondescript. You'll want to put a real name in here, and it's going to default based on the value here. So typically what I'll do is I'll put that down in the description so I know where it came from, but I'm going to say get names, and then you can rename the service config here to something useful. So make sure that you do that. The last field on here that's actually useful, depending on the type of service that you're calling, is this checkbox, which is disable user action. And what this does is that while this transaction is happening, while this service call is being made, pop up basically a wait, a spinning icon, so that you prevent the user from moving forward. And when I use this sometimes when I want to make sure that a user doesn't do something until the transaction is finished. So if it's maybe retrieving information from a backend service or something that takes some time, I don't want them clicking around and doing things while the service is going on. You can disable any sort of action while they're doing that just by checking that box, and it gives them a kind of a wait icon. And you'll just have to weigh that against performance and what service that you're calling to get that information out of here. So in this case, again, what I did was I just populated this drop down from a service call. Now, again, when this previews, it's going to pull back this list, and I can start to chain services together. So as we talked about, you can have services that are called on show or on load, but you can also have services called on different events. And so what happens here, when I choose a service or department, it then calls another service to go get some values, and then I do some JavaScript to push it about. And that's done simply on the onChange event. So just like I can call it on the onShow event, or just by the service here by populating the events, when this item changes, I can call another service, and all that does is the exact same thing. So I'm going to pass it the input, which is the name of the department. So from that drop-down list, I get the name, and I say go get the field that matches that. And then when that comes back, take the options that are returned from that and place it in the section called options. So you'll see here that this is, the layout's a little bit different than the other one. Since this is a retrieve, I'm only returning one record versus returning multiple. So I can take a single and put it into that options. And then again, you give it its name and populate through there. So each of these things interact. So I populated a drop down from that. I then put the services in the options. And then I did some JavaScript on this thing. It's not as important around this to do, but this is just something that you guys can see when you preview this, that I just then push those options into this drop down. So it's pulling back the results from that. So if you look at this form here, that's all that it is. It's a name, and then you can check off which values go into that, and it gets stored as a record. So I'm pulling back those values from that result. I mentioned before as far as access goes, so in your design settings, make sure that you allow permissions to be able to let people be able to edit this application or to be able to access the application as a service. And again, that's all going to go back. I think we had a session already on access controls and getting into that, but you want to make sure that your application is set up to be able to allow service calls to be made. Okay. Second service here that I'm going to talk about is connecting to a URL. So this is almost the same as calling another Volt application, except you're actually calling an external URL. And Volt does a great job with this because it does a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So if you have a service such as you see here that allows you to call, whether it's a lookup in CRM, or in this case, it's actually going to go out and get some IP information around it, you can call the service call. And then everything else after that is basically the same. Your inputs and your outputs, and your mapping of your outputs to your form, or if it's a post, your inputs to your form go around that. And this sample response that you see here, again, Volt does a lot of the heavy lifting for you, is that when you put in a valid URL call, it'll actually go and fetch what those results are, excuse me, and put them here. And these end up becoming basically the outputs of the service, so that you can match it to this. And then it also identifies the URL parameters. So if you want to pass it a value, or if you just want to pass whatever's directly in that. And you can also pass authentication pieces or request headers. So if you need to pass like a content type, or in some cases you need to pass an authentication type, you can add those values here within the service detail. So let me show you kind of what we mean by that. So one of the things that I do in this form application actually is on show for this item, I'm actually doing some JavaScript to go call this service and get my IP address. And what it does is it populates, I'll show you in here in the preview. It populates that IP address. So it gets my IP address by calling that service. So that's my local machine's IP address. But what I want to do then is call a service based on when that changes. So once I get that IP address again on this event, I want to call that. And this is the service that I call. And it's just a basic, it's one that I've signed up for, and it just returns a JSON payload of information about my IP address from that service. But what you'll notice is that when I put it in here, it's gone ahead and it's filtered out. Here's everything that's coming back. It's got the JSON components in there. If I wanted to pass it any request headers, or if I needed to pass any sort of authentication as required by the service, I could put it here. It also recognized parameters in the form. So this assignable means, do I want to pass it a value? So these, in essence, become your inputs. And my key is going to be static, but I want to pass it the IP address. So I'm going to give it a name, of IP. So once I've set up my service, everything else from here on out is the exact same. And this is what I was showing before. Some services require you to call an IP or to pass a required value. So all that I'm doing then is I'm going to get that IP address that was populated by my fetch call, and I'm going to pass it as an input. And then that JSON that you saw from the fetch, here are all my values that I could pass. And all I'm doing is I'm just grabbing two of the fields. I'm getting the region and the city from that. But I'm calling a service then based on the result of another event, just like I did with the dropdown. But instead of calling a Volt application, I'm calling an external service. So again, kind of give you an idea, and it populated this, then it made a call, and it got my city, and it got my region, and I populated that in there. So that's kind of the way that you can use external services to populate a form from a external piece, like a lookup in CRM or a call into a pricing application or something like that. Anything that's got a REST addressable URL, you can call into and then get the results back. This is also where you need to be cognizant too of what it's returning. So understanding what it's actually returning from the service so that you know how to structure your data. Because like I said, some services return arrays of data. And so you have to put it into a table first and then extract that data from the table around that. All right, so we talked about populating from a existing Bolt application. We talked about extracting from a external REST service. I talked about before being able to put greater than and less than type events. And so this is kind of building off of Marty's example that he did earlier on the course. And this is just a simple table. It returns a list of courses from the catalog. But what I want to do is I think, I can't go to class until June. So I want to see all the classes after June 1st. And so this is a way that you can then filter down based on the greater than or less than type scenarios in there. So if I put it out to August 1st, here's all the classes after August. And this works almost identically to how all the other searches work, but your input parameters become a little bit different. Just like I can put constants in there to search for a type of field, I can also do a search with constants. So all I did was I put the constant and then on the search operator. Now you'll notice search operator isn't showing yet. You actually need to select that from the advanced view. So what this is saying is that I'm going to put an operator, which is a string, a constant, which is greater than, onto the date. And then I'm going to search by date. So that date that I selected in the fields, I'm passing as an input, and anything greater than. You could also do things like contains. I could do things like less than, greater than, or equal to, different types of formats. And then the rest is the exact same. Here's what's coming back. Populate the form for my search results, or the table rather, and it updates the form. And that's just triggered on an on change. So in the date, again, you can trigger it from different places. The on change event, when that changes, I just call that service. And that's the exact same service that I call actually on show for the table, but the date's going to be empty. So it's passing an empty value in. And so it's just going to return all the values until that date has a value in it. And that's just a simple way to then create some filters around this. So maybe I wanted to filter by location, or I wanted to filter by instructor or something like that. All I would do is pass that in as a value. And you could do things like it's got to be an exact match, or it could be something like a contains. Okay. So that's showing things how to get applications populated either from Volt applications or from external REST service calls. Sometimes what we want to do is actually kind of chain or synchronize our calls. And what we mean by that is that you need to wait for a particular service to finish before you call another service. And this might be an idea where I want to go look up to see if an ID exists in another Volt application. And if it does, then I want to go get some information about that. Or maybe I want to block them from doing something or show a different field. But if I want to make sure that a service has finished being called before I either do some sort of action or I call another service, we need to put in what's called a listener. Now there's some best practices around this, and I'll kind of show you the different reasons you do this. So it says here the best practice is put it on the onload event, and that means because then it just loads once and it's always listening. The issue is that if you can put it into another event like an on change or an on update or whatever event outside of the on load, the one caveat you have to keep in mind is that you then have to disconnect that listener, because otherwise every time that event fires, it's going to create another listener, and you're going to hit some performance issues and have multiple loaders or listeners for the same event. So kind of as a best practice, put it in the onload event, but if you do put it in anywhere else, make sure that you put in a listener or a close connection to that listener. And I'll show you what we've got here on that. So just to give you an idea on the application, on the synchronized call, is what I'm going to do in this is I'm going to put in email address. And on change, what it does is it goes and it looks up into another application to try and find a match. And if it finds a match, then it goes back to that application and retrieves the geo. If somehow it doesn't find a match, then it's going to show me a different message around that. So what I'm doing is I'm synchronizing the calls because I want to make sure that that data call, because you have no, if you just put in call and call, then you're not quite sure when something's going to finish, and you're not guaranteed of the order of that event. So quite simply here, I have within the onload, I have this code here. I put some comments out here when we share this application out. So basically what it's doing is it's listening for this service called email lookup. And when it finishes and there's success, then I call this service here to go get the geo around that. And then as you can see here, I've got to comment it out because it's in the onload. But if it were anywhere else, I would need to have this disconnect event so that it would disconnect that listener. And then the next time it loads, it would create a new instance of that listener and then close it out as well around that. So you make sure you want to disconnect that, that call, but this is in the onload. So basically what's happening here is that, like I mentioned before, it's going to call that email lookup, which is invoked by the on item change. So when I change when I typed a value into the email address and tabbed out of it, it calls this service, which is to go look that field up, do a search. And then once that search is complete, it then calls the get geo around that field. And on the form, some basic rules around that just says that, excuse me, in the rules here, I'm just going to hide, if it's greater than 0, meaning that if I get a result back, then I want to show this geo field here. Otherwise, I just want to show no match. So that's all that's doing in there. But that's how you kind of synchronize two calls together. So that I want, once this email result has finished, then I go do something else, which is then to call the service here as well. Now, there's another way to do that too. One of the most common kind of use cases with Vault and is having some sort of queue or list where you're going to kind of work out of these items. So what I've got here is I've got a list of users, and this is using that same lookup as this lookup here did when I went to look up a user. It's just a list of users that comes back. And when I select a user, I then go call a service to populate these fields in here. Now, sometimes what you can do, and we talked about this in the tables section, is that you could open up that individual record and then edit that record and use the submit and update buttons around that. But if I just wanted a quick way to do this, what I could do is once I select it, maybe I'm going to move Elizabeth here into EMEA, and this update button is going to call a service. So again, services can be called on stages, they can be called on events, or they can be called here on the button as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to update that. It's going to give me a message that the user was updated, and then it's going to actually refresh this information. So now she's showing in EMEA. And this is another example of linking and synchronizing some service calls. So you can see here on the table, obviously I have an on-show event where I'm going to load the table. So it's going to go off to this service here, the user table, user application rather, pull this back and populate that table. Now I also have an on-click event that I set a hidden value to this, to the unique ID of the user I selected. So this is useful. We covered this in the table section too, I believe. So I'm getting the selection, the row that I selected, and then I set a value in there to that unique ID. I could have called a service here as well, but just to kind of show you how you can chain some things together. So that once I set that select UID, when it changes, then I call this service where I pass that UID, and then I return into the form that you saw down below for me to update that form. And so, like I said, you could have called it directly from this event here where I could have called the service. I just wanted to show sometimes you have to put in filters and some other things that show up in that value. Then once that's done, I've populated the table down below with the results from that service. And this update is just another service, whereas before I've been doing reads and retrieves. This one's going to do an update, and the button's a little bit different. You could obviously put it in the on-click event, but there's also a place in here where you can call this service that's clicked. And all this service does, as we talked about before, it's calling an update. And so what I'm doing is I'm passing it that unique ID that from the selected record, and then I'm going to update the following fields. You could put additional criteria in the search by, so if you needed to narrow down what you wanted to update, but then here's all of your update fields as to anything else that I wanted to update into the form. And there's no outputs on this because it's pretty basic, but you did notice I had a pop-up button, and then this table reloaded after I did an update. And again, that's done by the listener. So the listener says, listen for the update user event. And when that gets fired, pop up a message, says user's been updated. And then I call that same service to reload the table. So basically kind of doing a refresh in that event. So another way to kind of serialize objects together so that once one of service is finished, then I want to do some sort of action. And it doesn't necessarily have to call another service. It could be to show an alert. It could be to update another field. It could be to do some sort of other action. But basically anything that you're doing here, it's going to trigger that service in there and keep those two things tied together. All right, so one of the last things here, I'm going to touch on this briefly. This is something that's coming, but something to be aware of. There's a concept called custom transports, and a custom transport could be created and deployed by an administrator and then made available to all of your end users. And typically where we see this is it's leveraging the same HTTP transport that the other services use, but it hides all of the transactions behind it. So maybe you have to go get an authentication token where you need to pass a password, or if it's a common service like get manager or get country or get price or something like that, where you don't want the users to have to know the actual REST call, the URL, you can create a transport, place it in a particular directory within Bolt, and then it makes it available in the general directory in your services configuration. So there's a link in the presentation at the end that talks more about the service transport and the documentation, as well as a service description file around that. But to kind of give you an idea of one, I've got one here, and I'll make it a little bit bigger. This is a pretty basic one. This one goes out to Microsoft to get a token that can then be used to do other lookups and things like that. But it's got some information in it, such as password and things like that, and that's been changed out here. But where you're going to pass username and password, and you wouldn't want to make this available to all the end users. So this would sit on the server. You're basically configuring, I won't go into the whole configurations and the documentation here, but you're basically telling it what you're passing. You're building your request in the HTTP transport, and then all the parameters that it's going to return and their type. And so this becomes just another service that's available to you in your services settings. So for example, if I wanted to create, and again, underneath general, you'll see here. So this is the service that's been registered with the service, or the server, excuse me, and I can select it. And you could have multiple in here. Like I said, there may be some in here by get employee manager, get whatever, that have been provided and can be reused. Everything from here on out is the exact same. This one doesn't require any inputs, but it does have outputs. So for example, I'm going to get that access token, and I'm going to place it in a hidden field somewhere on the form. And then that token is then available for me to use on other servers if I want to pass it, or if I want to do something with it. So for example, you can see here, it's on load, I called that service, and I populated the MS token. And then I could use that going forward to then pass that as a parameter to another form to do, like I have another service to update credit limit within CRM. And one of the things I have to pass it is an authorization. And so I could pass that authorization token as part of the header and pass that service in there and have it update CRM or the price book or something like that. So you can have services that are defined here as a service for another application or for a URL, or as we talked about here with the general piece, you can have some made available to your end users. And this is coming in the next release. This isn't as of today, but wanted to introduce that to you because it is a very important concept and very useful and powerful as far as the HTTP transport and being able to make common services available for everybody so they don't have to do that. So to kind of wrap up here, obviously you can use services to populate fields. We talked about populating a drop-down list. We talked about populating individual fields based on selections. So go retrieve a specific record and return that and populate your form. You can use services within the existing application. So like when I looked up the departments, that was within the same application. Or I wanted to go look in other Volt applications, such as the user repository to get a list of users and their information about that. Or you can use REST services or through the custom transport. So there's lots of different ways. The good thing about it is they all function the same way. They have inputs, they have outputs, and you kind of follow the same piece. They can be called on events. They can be called on submit. And that's one thing I didn't show you here. So actually in stages. So when you do a submit action within one of the stages, obviously you can send an email. We talked about this in the workflow stage, but you can also call a service. And again, from here, it's the exact same process. Am I calling an external service? Am I calling one from the current application? Am I calling an available one or from another Volt application within the environment? And then that gets called upon successful submit around that. So events, submit, or you can synchronize them through JavaScript calls. They can perform all the same actions for Volt: retrieve, search, update, create, delete, but make sure that you have set your permissions correctly so that your services are available to do that. And then lastly, just as a preview, something called custom transports, so that you can make available to all the end users so that they don't have to know, the URLs, or if you don't need to share passwords, or if it's something that's commonly used, such as getting an OAuth token or something like that, you can create a custom transport around that to do the submission, and the user just fills out the inputs and the outputs around that. So thanks for joining. I know there's a bit of a fire hose. Take a look at that. I'll make these presentations and applications available, and happy servicing.